Good evening and welcome to St. Margaret's, to the next in our Inspirational Women webinar series. And we thank Aberdeen Standard Capital for their support of this event. This evening, I'm delighted to be chatting with Jordan Brooks, who's joining us from Washington, DC. Hi, Jordan. Welcome to St. Margaret's.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you.
The pleasure is all ours. Jordan, you have been the Deputy Executive Director at the White House for the Council for Girls and Women, and you're now Executive Director for the United States of Women. Can I just start this evening by asking you to share with us some of the experiences that have led you to those incredible roles?
Sure. And thank you all. It's so nice to be here with you. And so nice. It's always so nice to speak to a high school of young women who are doing incredible work themselves. So we're always so excited to be here with you guys. I think it's interesting. I was very lucky and I worked really hard. I think those are two things that fit really well together as a part of how I ended up here. I started working on the Obama Biden campaign back what seems like a really long time ago when you were all probably very young. But it was right out of college. I was a gender studies and political science major in college. Very infrequently, I feel like, does your major really like translate to the rest of your life? But this is what happened to me. And I was trying to figure out if I wanted to go work in Washington, if I wanted to, go work in a different country, thinking about gender in a different country. I'd written my senior thesis at university on political quotas for women in parliaments in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I thought at some point that I would want to go back and do that. But, I had this opportunity to go work on the Obama campaign as an organizer. And that was really the thing that brought me to the rest of my life. I mean, it is a really unbelievable sort of trajectory in that if I hadn't taken that job, which was a real risk, I had no idea if there was going to be anything on the back end of that, but I really believed in what President Obama was talking about. I believed in, the equity messages that he was bringing to the country. And so I took a leap and decided to move from Indiana, which is where I was in school, to Southwest Virginia and started organizing people there. And the rest of that was sort of history. I was very lucky to be able to then go work in the White House after we won for 8 years, working for the vice president, who is now the president, and then also working for the first lady for several years. And then, as you mentioned, Leona, running the White House Council on Women and Girls, which was really our way of making sure we were talking about all federal policy and all work that was happening across the federal government with a gender lens. So on everything from transportation policy to healthcare to violence against women, we really wanted to make sure we were talking about everything with a gender lens on it. And we built the United States of Women when we were inside the White House. So Valerie Jarrett, who was senior advisor to the president, Tina Chen, who was the First Lady's chief of staff, myself and my colleague, Kalisha, who was our policy advisor at the council, we realized that a lot of the organizations that were doing really incredible work on gender equity issues weren't necessarily talking to each other and weren't necessarily sharing and working together. And so we felt like we could build this incredible thing called the United States of Women, where people could share those best practices with each other, could work across issue area, because we know that women and girls don't live their lives in silos. And so we really wanted to make sure we were building a big community of those organizations and individuals across the country in the US, but also really abroad to talk to each other and to work together. And so I know, Leona, we'll talk about this later, but we built this enormous summit called the United States of Women Summit. The first one we did in 2016, which had 5,000 women and girls come from all across the world to talk about the solutions that they were finding that worked in their communities. And that was while we were still in the White House. And it was sort of a culmination of all of our work, but also really the beginning of the United States of Women that I now lead and run now. And I think the reasons I was very lucky to have these roles is partially because of hard work, taking risks, and thinking that I could do something, even though I had never had that experience before. But I also had an incredible group of mentors that were mostly women that really lifted me up at every chance they could. And so that's part of, part of what I try to do now as a mid-30s professional, trying to make sure that I'm doing the same thing. So I don't know if that answered your question, Leona, but that's sort of the
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely fantastic. For those of you who've already found the question function, it should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If you'd like to pop any questions in, then I can put those to Jordan for you. Jordan, talk to me about what you feel was the most exciting thing that you achieved while you were working in the White House.
That's a great question. There are so many things, I think, and it is really interesting. You feel like when you're in that building and when you're at the federal government at that level, there is a real ability to get a lot done on a daily basis and really help to change people's lives in a way that I think is really hard to do anywhere else on such a large scale. But I think there are two things that I would say that were probably my biggest highlights. One is very specific, right? Like the United States of Women Summit was an enormous thing that had enormous impact, where people still come up to me on a weekly basis and say, I was at that 2016 summit and I met my now business partner, or I met somebody who helped fund my work, or I met someone who changed my life. And that was a really exciting thing to still see those ripple effects happening on a daily basis. Plus, it was really fun to watch Mrs. Obama and Oprah talk to each other. So that's always a really good, fun thing. So that was sort of the culmination of all of our work. But I think the thing that was the most, that I'm the most proud of on a daily basis is really my colleague Kalisha and I spent an incredible amount of time making sure that the White House was a really open place for people. And I think the thing that we always preached was that all of these policies that we were building affected women and girls in very specific ways, but we shouldn't be building those policies without talking to those people who those policies affect. And so we spent a lot of time bringing in young girls of color to the White House to talk to us about what their lives were like, bringing in people who were being affected by health disparities, bringing in people who, were getting a sub minimum wage, or just really making sure we were talking to people and really listening, as opposed to just talking at people, and making sure that we were really having those conversations. So that is, I think, it's hard to pinpoint as one moment, but it really did change the way we think about building policy at that level. And I think you'll see it happening today in the new Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration. I mean, they sort of do the exact same thing, because we all come from this organizing background where it is so important to be including, but really letting the people who are affected by the work lead. That's the thing that I think I'm most proud of, and we continue to do today at the United States of Women.
Fantastic. There's lots of fans of a good White House drama online this evening. Absolutely, West Wing, Scandal, Madam Secretary. How true are any of these giving us a real insight, and what's a day in the White House really like?
So I love all of those, and I binge them. Yes. You can ask any of my friends. I have probably watched the West Wing all the way through like 8 times. It's very silly. I would say in terms of like, the ones that are realist to the ones that are the least real, West Wing is very, very close to reality, because they had a lot of people who had previously worked in the White House consult on that work. And if you watch it now, it's really interesting. It was, being filmed 20 years ago at this point, which dates me and is stressful. But they, a lot of the work that they're talking about in there is still happening today, which is concerning in many ways, right? Because they talk about a paid family leave policy, and it still isn't law in America today. But a lot of what it looks like in terms of talking to Congress and all of those meetings and those things is pretty true to reality. But I think some of them like Scandal, which I love, obviously.
Yeah.
And we're big Shonda Rhimes fans here. And, it's some of that is real, but a lot of that day-to-day, like murdering and stuff, that's not real.
That's not real. Good to know.
But a lot of the things that are scandalous are not real, I will say. But I think the thing that's interesting about a day in the life at the White House is that they're never the same. You will never have a day that is exactly the same as the day before it. And that is partially because so much of what we do, we're trying to be proactive about building new policies and building things. But so much of what ends up happening is you have to react to what's happening in the world. And so, and what's happening in Congress and what's happening all across the place. And so, I would go from having a meeting on, I don't know, healthcare coverage for women and girls in this country to having a meeting on transportation policy, to having a meeting on, bringing girls in about STEM education in their schools, to thinking about how we were talking about girls who were living and not going to school, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries, but also in some of our, just in some of the countries all over the world that we were working with. And so I think the difference is, the thing about a day in the life in the White House is that's one day, and then the next day I'm talking about something completely different, but you still have to do the follow-up from the day before. So it is a 24-hour-a-day experience, but it is never the same. And so, I would get there at, whatever time in the morning, get my coffee and my oatmeal, and that was literally the only thing that was the same every day. So yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Brilliant. In another interview that you did, you talked about your experience in the White House and things moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. And, people are human, we make mistakes, but you can't let those mistakes hijack your day, which is really good advice. But how do you achieve that?
Yeah, it took me a long time to
get
there, right? It took many a time of me crying in the bathroom, right, in the First Lady's office or something, just being like, oh, I can't believe I messed up this thing. I had an incredible, I think part of the reason I can say that today is because I had an incredible group of women bosses who are still my mentors today. I talk about Tina Chen a lot, who was the First Lady's chief of staff. And if I ever came in and said, this thing happened, I totally screwed this thing up, I messed up whatever it was, right? A briefing or a whatever, she would look at me and she'd say, okay, so how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen again? And that is the thing that I think I take out of every single one of those experiences. She would never get mad at me. She would never yell at me. She would never do any of those things, but she would say, okay, great, that's all right. But what did we learn from that? And how do we make sure that that doesn't happen again? And I think that is such incredibly important advice to let, just if you make the same mistake twice, that's an issue. But if you make a mistake and then you fix it, you figure out what the solution is to the problem of how you fixed it, and you come to your supervisor or your boss or whoever and say, this is what happened, here's how I'm going to fix it, more likely than not, they're going to say, great, you've got a solution to fix it, go fix it. And that was always the thing that I think I carry with me on the back end of that too, is I never want my team to come to me with a problem without thinking about what the solution is to the problem. You don't have to have the whole answer, right? But think about, like, what are the ways that we could potentially fix this problem? And I will say it really did take a long time to help get over those things. But part of it is just that you don't have time to dwell on the fact that you totally screwed something up. There are 4,000 things flying at you after that. And so you have to really, you can't dwell in it, because then it'll ruin your entire day and you'll continue making new and bigger mistakes because you're letting it just completely overtake you. You have to learn from it, but then you have to move on. And it's easier said than done, obviously. But by learning from it, you sort of feel like, all right, I now understand why this happened and I won't do it again. It also really helps to have great bosses who understand those sorts of things. So it's harder when you feel like there's a lot of there's not a lot of understanding, but
Yeah,
I think
sure.
you sort of give yourself a little bit of grace, for lack of a better term, to understand what happened and learn from it. I think will make you better. Will help you be better off long term. Anyway, so
Yeah, thank you very much. I think all presidents can have that, beautiful photograph outside the White House, and it all just looks lovely and wonderful. But there was something kind of special, or it felt like there was something kind of special about the Obamas. Was that British media, or do you think that's true?
No, I think it's definitely true. They're an incredibly special family, and I always say, what you got from them publicly is who they were privately. The former first lady is incredibly smart and driven, and also incredibly kind and compassionate. Her hugging children in the vegetable garden is exactly like that is who she is, and cares. She cares so much about the work that she does and cares so much about the people for whom she's doing the work. That is all very real. And I think they're a very special family for so many reasons. I think because they were also this incredible, they were the first Black family to live in the White House. And for young people, particularly, to grow up seeing that, it is incredibly important. Several of my bosses always said, you can't be what you can't see. And so for so many young, particularly Black girls and boys in the United States, it was such an incredible thing to be able to see at the highest levels everywhere, for the first time, but also, frankly, for white girls and boys to see that, right? That is so important for everyone to say, this is exactly who should be in the White House, and we're so thrilled to have them there. I think that was really important too. But also, they are just really wonderful, incredibly smart, genuine people, which was always great to work for them because that was true.
Fantastic. A couple of questions just come in.
Yeah.
What was it like working with Michelle Obama, which I think you've kind of addressed a little already, and does she ever have a bad day?
It's a great question. I think we all have bad days, right? I couldn't tell you about one that she had, but I think we all have, days that we feel less like we want to go do this thing every day, and I can't imagine what it was like to be her. It's an incredibly difficult, scrutinized job. The thing that I always think is so incredible about Mrs. Obama is that she really, as I mentioned before, like really cares about the work. And I think she's always the smartest person in the room. She's a genius. So she was always very good about asking smart questions about the work that you were presenting to her, sort of helping to pull apart what would work and what wouldn't work in terms of some of the policies, or also the outreach you were doing. She's just like such a great thought partner, even in how we built some of that work, which was so cool and so different, I think, from a lot of other people in Washington sometimes. And so that was really fantastic to be with her. And I think, I just can't imagine what it is like, right? If you have to go from some of those meetings to having to host state dinners to having to do all sorts of things. But she always really did it with such incredible grace. And I think it's amazing. I had a lot of bad days, so I can't imagine. I imagine everybody does, but we never knew it. So.
Okay, can I ask how the direction of your work changed, and what was different in the Trump administration?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we built the United States of Women with sort of a feeling that we were going to be living the next 4 years of our lives under a Hillary Clinton presidency. And it's a shame that we all assumed that, I think, because I think that's part of the reason we ended up where we did. But it was, our whole intent was to really be helpful and to help build a big movement around some of the work that we knew she was going to do. And so, on that day, which was, I will tell you guys, one of the worst days of my life, I think, that I can remember. One of my best friends and I had gone to New Hampshire to work for a couple of weeks. We took off from the White House, and we took time off work and went to New Hampshire to help Hillary Clinton, and because one of our friends was the state director there. And I very, very vividly remember my fiance at the time coming up to see me that on election day so that he could be there with me. And he walked in the room at like 9 p.m. and I was like, I can't see a man right now. I can't talk to you. And poor guy, he reads that a lot, I think. But it really was one of those days where then my best friend Claire and I drove home the next day and cried the whole time. I will tell you, we also listened to every Adele album, and cried the entire way home because we listened to Hillary Clinton talk about how she didn't want young girls to feel like they couldn't do everything they wanted to do because of this, and we didn't want this to be a setback. But we knew it was both a horrible feeling about the fact that we knew partially misogyny and, anti-feminism was part of the reason that she lost. The other thing was that we were so afraid of what President Trump would do. And I think at that time, on that day, in November of 2016, I don't think we had any idea how bad it could get. And so that's just like a little backstory of how we all felt here, and that I know people across the world felt as well. But our work at the United States of Women was really going to be to support this incredible progressive agenda that we knew then Secretary Clinton was going to, hopefully President Clinton was going to put in place, and everything from paid leave to ending violence against women to, working around the world to make sure women and girls had the support they need. And so we very quickly had to pivot. And we spent a lot of time in that first December and January, even before he was inaugurated, doing trainings, doing big coalition-wide phone calls to talk about what we were going to do as a community, as a gender equity movement, and how we could push back on what we knew was coming. And, I will say it was obviously everyone experienced the Women's March on January 21st, 2020 or 2016. And it was an incredible groundswell just of people both recognizing the work that had been done for so long in communities across the country that hadn't been recognized before, and also, really sort of coming to their own activism in many ways. And so we got a lot of incoming from people who didn't know what to do. And part of what the next 4 years of our work was really to help people understand they have the power themselves to be activists, to do something, to really make sure that they're taking action on a whole host of issues, to train them on what that means, whether that's from organizing to, coalition building to communication strategy. And then really to make sure people understood that, whatever your skill set was, whether you're a web developer or a communications professional or a student, you have the ability to really organize your community, or you also have the ability to give your skills to somebody who's already doing that. And so that really was it was a very different trajectory in our work than we thought it would be previously. And we had to fight against, it was very different because instead of pushing for new progressive ideals, we were fighting against what we knew would be just an erosion of so many of the supports we had already put in place for women and girls that were just getting destroyed as opposed to moving the ball forward. And so that was really hard. And I am
absolutely
glad I will tell you, very glad.
But brighter times, Biden seems to be really elevating the position of women. It was a woman who ran his campaign, was it not? And, a woman on the ticket for vice president. He's really recently put lots of women into really key roles. So what impact is that having? What does it mean for the work you're now doing?
I mean, it's incredible, right? I think you can go back to the "you can't be what you can't see" argument first and foremost and say, well, Vice President Harris is now the first ever female vice president, and little girls can see that all across the country and all around the world. So first and foremost, that's important. But generally, I think there are so many incredible women, as you mentioned, across the administration that are really changing the way we think about federal policy. So even, the fact that last night the president gave a speech at a joint session of Congress, which is normally the State of the Union address, but because it is his first year, they don't call it that. And he laid out a very, very progressive agenda on how we are going to support American women and American families. That happened because he believes it, but also because there are women at the highest levels of the Domestic Policy Council, at the National Economic Council. The economists who figured out how to pay for it are all women, and they are the ones who know what is going to be important, especially on the back end of this pandemic for women and girls. And they know that the economy is only going to be better if we actually help women and girls, particularly women and girls of color who have borne the brunt of this pandemic. And so, I think without those women there, it would have been a different conversation. Not because President Biden doesn't believe it. He does, absolutely. But you need all of the people across all of those different power positions to be able to build something like that. And I believe strongly that a diversity of voices is the most important and effective way to build real change in this country. And I will say you have that in the new Biden administration, which is it's just so exciting and really, really. I am still on a high from last night's speech, mostly because the issues I've been working on my entire career, were in that speech last night, and we, for the first time in a really long time, have an opportunity to really put in place structures that can really change the lives of women and girls in this country. So it's exciting.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got lots of questions pinging in for you. Yeah. So somebody saying, great work, but don't you think the glass ceiling is still there and women not only have to demonstrate they're good, but also better than their male colleagues?
Yes.
Yeah, in short.
Yeah, I will tell you, Tina, my mentor and former boss, who I talk about a lot, told me a story once of she's an Asian woman, and she was a partner at a major law firm here in the US before she came to the White House. And she often tells a story of the fact that she was in a boardroom once with all men and a couple of junior associates who were underneath her, and the clients across the table from her. And her clients automatically looked at the two white male associates that were sitting next to her and asked the questions of them. Mm-hmm. Tina, of course, because she's amazing, spoke up and explained everything, and gave them the brief, talked about the way they were going to pursue the case, et cetera, et cetera. And they finally realized that she was obviously the senior person in the room. But yeah, absolutely, that glass ceiling exists everywhere. If it didn't, Hillary Clinton would have been president. And the reality of that story I tell about Tina is she always also said to me, and I really took this to heart, we have to be more prepared. And the thing that she always said was that she always made sure, regardless of what room she was in, she was the most prepared person in the room. And she understood what she was talking about, because then they have nothing to say about why you should be there. You are clearly contributing in the way that you should be. And that, I will say, is crappy, right? Like, that's terrible that is the thing that has to be the case. But until we get to full equity in this country and around the world, unfortunately, women have to be more prepared. And what we need to do is make sure that we're also including male allies in these conversations, I think is really, really important. And making sure that they know that these things happen, and understanding, you know, what that all looks like and what it feels like to be in a space like that, whether you're in a boardroom or you're in Congress or whatever. You know, we really need to make sure that we're having those conversations, not just with each other, but with everyone. So yeah, unfortunately, that glass ceiling is still here. And we do everything to chip away at it every day that we can. It's getting better, but it's still there.
Okay, another question just come in. How can the Western world help developing countries address women's rights?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really important thing that I do less work on currently, but especially in the White House during our time there, we had a lot of colleagues that worked in the National Security Council and at the State Department and at our International Development Agency, USAID, that spent a lot of time thinking about gender and how we could work to do some of that work, particularly in countries. And I will say a lot of those people really believe that if you, in the same way that you would in America, if you lift up women and girls and give women and girls the tools to thrive, then economies are better, countries grow, there is more peace and security. So all of that is really important. You know, we spent a lot of time building a couple of things inside the White House that I think are really interesting, and I know a number of governments also in other countries have done as well, is thinking about how when we are both distributing aid but also negotiating with other countries, how are we listening to women and girls on the ground? How are we giving people, especially when we're distributing aid, how are we giving women and girls loans? How are we working to actually, in the same way you would do while organizing in your own country, how are you actually listening to the people whose lives are affected by the work, right? Like we can't, I think it's always an enormous problem when a country like the US goes into a place and says, this is what's best. That's not right. Like we need to be listening to the people on the ground and helping them, giving them the tools that they need to succeed with their own ideas and with their own work. So that's first and foremost an important thing. The other thing that we talked about a lot, and I think they're still talking about a lot now in the Biden administration, is security of a country, particularly peace and anti-war and security, really is aided and continues to grow if you are empowering women and girls. And so there was an entire plan and a national action plan on women, peace, and security, and how we were making sure that women were deeply involved in any sort of security and peace negotiations, how we were, and that is, so it's a part of that plan, but then also really thinking about how, you know, we are helping women and girls economically. That's a huge part of security in countries. And then the final thing that I'll talk about that is something that is still ongoing and very, very important is, I can't remember the number off the top of my head right now, but millions and millions and millions of girls are not in school in countries around the world. And Mrs. Obama particularly, this became a big interest of hers. She built the Global Girls Alliance, which is a thing that still exists at the Obama Foundation and something she's still working on. And as you said, in the Western world, we can help to make sure we are talking to organizations that are helping to get girls in school. Every time we have a conversation about security, it should be about how are we making sure every girl in that country is educated through high school, at least. How do we make sure that those are the priorities? Because if we're educating all of these young women and girls, their ability to be able to thrive economically then is increased, you know, 4 or 5-fold, and then the country is more stable. So at the very, very root of how we can be helping with, you know, women and girls in other countries, it is really about making sure that we are talking about education. So that's the thing that I think is sort of the silver bullet is the wrong term, but it is the thing that more than anything else is the most important piece, because it changes attitudes, it changes cultures, it changes economic stability, it changes security. It is really important. So That's the thing I talk about the most.
Okay. On your Twitter, great. The hashtag is every issue is a gender issue. Talking about that, climate change, COVID, poverty, all gender issues.
All of them. So the reason we built the work in the White House in the way that we did with the White House Council on Women and Girls was because we really wanted to make sure that across the federal government, whether that was in our trade ministry or in our, in our healthcare, cabinet department, any of those sort of places, we were having a gender lens put on all of the issues that we were talking about, because women and girls, particularly women and girls of color, are affected differently by each of these issues. And so, we launched this campaign, Every Issue is a Gender Issue, just a couple of weeks ago, because we felt like we wanted to put a stake in the ground, both domestically, but really around the world, to say that it's not just things like women's health and paid leave and childcare that are gender issues. Every issue is a gender issue because it is affecting women and girls differently. So, for instance, climate change is a really great one, because in places where there is intense, smog or pollution, particularly in places in the South in the United States, where there are a lot of factories, women and girls have higher asthma rates than men and boys in many of those places. There are all sorts of different reasons as to why that's happening. People who are being displaced by climate change, 80% of those people are women and girls, is the number that we're hearing right now. And that is because often women and girls are, women and their families are taken together in different places. They are, sometimes men are left behind to try to find work or whatever. But women and girls are displaced at 80% of the time, which is an insane number. And that is just going to continue to get worse and worse and worse as we continue to see new climate diaspora happening across the world. And so climate change is a great one because I think it's really important. The other one that I keep mentioning, transportation safety, mostly because I'm obsessed with it, but there is because this is crazy, right? There is a new stat in the US where women die at a 17% higher rate than 17% more than men in car accidents, partially because they have built crash test dummies as the anatomically cisgender male. So there are no breasts on those crash test dummies. And if you've ever been in a car, you're like, why does that belt feel weird? Like, why doesn't this fit in you right?
Yeah.
It's because it wasn't tested on a female and anatomical body. And so, but those things are real, right? Those are real issues that you wouldn't normally think about, but are really, really important. So, I also like to think about in the US, we have an extraordinary student loan debt problem. It is an extraordinary crisis. Billions and billions of dollars of debt are being held by people all across this country from their debt from university. And it is really hamstringing my generation and the generation below me to have full economic fulfilled lives, right? To be able to buy houses, to be able to have families, to be able to do whatever you want to do with your life. It is really constraining people. And the reality there is that Black women, particularly in this country, hold considerably more student debt than anybody else. And so when we think about that, that is also constraining the economic ability of Black women. And that is because Black women are going to college and going to, graduate school at higher rates than almost anybody else. And so, but, that issue is an extraordinary problem in this country. And so basically, we're just really trying to think about how do you think about every issue you see happening across the world at this point? How do you put a gender lens on it? And particularly, how do you also put a race and gender lens on it? Because the intersectionality of that is really, really important. There's a lot of work that we're starting to do in the US, but I think other countries have done a much better job of in many places, disaggregating data so that we're talking about not just women and men. First of all, it's hard enough to get that data Second of all, how are we talking about Black women and ABI women and Latina women and Native women, as opposed to just talking about women and men? And so anyway, I could talk about this forever, but it is something that's really important.
Well, I'm going to give a plug to your United States of Women TV, which is airing on Instagram. And on there, you've got some absolutely fantastic interviews, which really bring a lot of these issues to light and do put that gender lens on them. So definitely worth people checking that out. I've got a couple of questions I'll put to you together. So one is, can men be feminists, and how do we teach boys to be feminists?
It's a great question. Yes, absolutely, men can be feminist. My fiance has a t-shirt that says what a feminist looks like. Absolutely. And I think, Leona, you and I talked about this a little bit when we prepped. I think feminism has gotten a little bit of a bad rap over the last couple of years. Feminism is really about making sure that everyone, regardless of gender, is equal, and making sure that people have the same opportunities regardless of their gender. And I do mean regardless of their gender. So we're talking not just about cisgender women, we're talking about trans women, we're talking about non-binary people, we're talking about everyone, making sure that we have an equal playing field. And so in that way, if you think about feminism in that way, absolutely, men can be feminists and men should be feminists, right? Like, we want to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity. And so that is really the way I think about feminism. And, that is because women and trans women and non-binary people don't have those same opportunities. So we're really making sure that we are bringing everybody up together. How do we teach men and boys to be better about some of these things? And how do we teach them to be feminists? I have a lot of colleagues, particularly those who have children, who have written a lot about this that I think is really, really exciting work that's coming out right now. I mean, I think there are a few things that we can say in the beginning is, especially, we should be having conversations with the men in our lives and the boys in our lives about some of these disparities, about how it feels when someone interrupts you in a meeting, about how it feels when that's sort of a small example, but very important, especially to start with. How does it feel when you realize you're getting paid less than your male counterpart who does the exact same job? What does that look like? I think half the battle potentially is that because sometimes men and boys aren't experiencing the same things that women are facing, they don't see it. And they're not, they don't grow up in that space. And so that's sort of the first step, I think, especially in the working world, we talk about that a lot. But for young men and boys, I think it is really important to have those conversations with your friends and start there, and talk about, what you're seeing in school, what you're facing in school. That stuff is really, really important. When I think about eventually, if I decide to have children, and what I would teach my young boy is that they can do whatever they want. So I am not going to teach that young boy that he has to like trucks and baseball, although my fiance would be forced to play baseball, but he can also love ballet, and he can also love cooking, and he can also love all of these things that are traditional gender roles. We need to be saying that our children can do whatever they want to do and whatever that means to them. And I think there is a lot of really great work that's happening right now to make sure that children don't feel like they have to be constrained in these boxes that society puts on them. And it is so exciting to see. I mean, the generation of students right now that living in this world is doing it already. You guys are all incredible. We should all the time. And I think about all these young activists who are really changing the game on how we talk about gender roles, how we talk about gender as a spectrum broadly. You guys are the ones we should be listening to because you're doing it already. And I think that's exciting, and I love seeing of that, how far that work has come, even over the course of my 15-year career, and since I was a student, right? It is just a wildly different place than it was before. The only other thing I'll say is, in the United States, we have and I don't know if this is the same in Scotland, but in the United States, we have a very serious campus sexual assault and harassment problem in this country. And you know, one of my colleagues who runs the It's On Us campaign is really about engaging men and boys in that conversation. And for us, it is about how do you change the culture around this to say, if you see, I mean, this is a university issue, particularly the example that I'm going to talk about, but if you see someone, you know, that's taking a girl somewhere and or a boy somewhere and they look, you know, like they cannot consent to something, like we should be, that's not okay. We should be talking about affirmative consent conversations and making sure we are teaching young boys that. And so the It's On Us campaign is really about how do you be a good bystander? How do you make sure you're talking about affirmative consent, particularly at boys? And there's so much of that is a really particularly nuanced but really important part of this conversation as well. So.
Well, I think you've partially answered my next question.
Yeah.
I feel really strongly that schools are places where we create safe spaces to facilitate really important conversations. So what are those conversations that I should be having with young people now? What are those conversations we should be facilitating?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that one particularly, I think, is really important. Consent generally for everyone is so important, especially before students go off to university, right? It's a really very different time. I think the conversations we should be having are about as well about how we are thinking about gender just broadly across all issues. Like the same thing we've been talking about here too. It's like what are the different ways people are experiencing all of these different things across the world and across their own identities. And you know, we also have an incredible racism problem in America. We are talking particularly about the intersection of race and gender all the time. And I think, you know, that is a really important conversation to be having as well. And I think in schools, you know, especially in high schools, so many of these issues are things that we should be talking about all the time with students so that they're not all of a sudden at, you know, 30 talking about these issues for the first time. I think and as I said, students are already doing it. Like they are already facilitating these conversations. They are leading in so many ways, particularly around climate change. It is incredible to watch young students, and particularly around violence issues. And I know that's happening around the world as well. And I think there's just so much ability for young women and boys and everyone particularly right now to have conversations just because of the access we have. You know, normally I wouldn't be able to talk to you, but I am here in Washington and you guys are in Scotland. And so there's so much ability to really be able to change the conversation. So it's exciting.
Fantastic. Going back to our chat earlier about the summit, when are you planning to have the next one?
Well, we were going to do one. We did one in 2018. We were going to do one in 2020. Unfortunately, obviously, the pandemic hit. And so you really can't have 10,000 people in a room, let alone 2 people in a room. So, so we are hoping to do one in 2022. Hopefully, we will be able to have more people in spaces together as soon as everyone gets vaccinated. That's my plug for the day. But really making sure that we're safe. But I think the cool part about that is I think people really miss the ability to get together in community, which I totally agree with. We miss it a lot. But I also think it has opened up an ability for us to do some hybrid work too. So how do we have people in community, but that community really means everyone all over the world. So I think there's really exciting opportunity to be able to do some virtual, in-person, hybrid.
Fantastic. So we could come to the next summit then.
Sure, absolutely. We'd love that.
Fantastic.
We'd love that.
Well, I think we could probably chat all evening, but I'm really conscious of time and I'm so grateful for the time that you've given up. And thank you for the work that you do every day in the name of women. And know that here at St. Margaret's, we are also flying that flag. We recognise as a girls' school our responsibility to empower young women and to break down those gender stereotypes. So thank you so much, Jordan, for your time. It's been really fun chatting with you.
Thank you all so much for having me. It was my pleasure. And thank you for everything you all are doing on a daily basis. I know you all are activists and organizers and doing incredible work. So anything you ever need, join us at United States of Women. We're here to help in any sort of way we can as well. And thank you. And you all are inspiring me with the work you're doing. So thank you for having me. Really excited to.
Well, we'll certainly keep in touch. And thank you to everyone at home who's joined us this evening. And if you'd like to sign up for the next webinar in the series, then please do visit our website and get signed up. Okay, thank you so much and good evening.
Have a good one.